write. I'm a poet, but I usually write out of my own life experience. And this is a book of poetry about a historical event that happened in prison. And I was inspired by a book by poet Frank Walker called The Unghosting of Medgar Evers, which is it's a book of poetry, but it tells the story of the assassination of Medgar Evers, who was the secretary of the NAACP in Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi. And that book, he has voices from many different perspectives. Myrlie Evers, the wife of Medgar, from the person who killed Medgar Evers, from his wife. So a lot of different voices to tell, to shed light on the historical event. And that inspired me to want to try something more out of my own, speaking in other voices. And the experience of being inside a prison is strange enough. I don't know how many of you have been inside a prison. I have co-led a book club at Anamosa State Penitentiary for a number of years. And you know, you go into the Sally Port and you're kind of stuck between two gates, and there's this moment where you just feel kind of closed in. But Angola, which is where this event happened, is, from my perspective, a very unique prison. It's a plantation, it's a farm, a working farm. It's 18,000 acres, so it's enormous. And it was designed in its location to be very isolated. The Mississippi River is one border of the prison land. A wild area called the Tunica Hills is another border of the prison. And it's in the middle of nowhere. And in fact, originally to get to Angola, you had to go by boat before the road was built. So it's just a very unusual prison. Let me see here. Yeah, there's the entrance. But I wanted to start, I'll say more about what the book is really about in a minute. But I want to start with a poem that was my first time going to Angola. I went there to do research for the book. And it's just, it was such a different experience just going there. So this is about getting to Angola. It's called The Long and Winding Road. Once, you could only get there by boat. Now there's a narrow road through the tangle of the Tunica Hills. No shoulder, dead-ending at the gate. From the turnoff onto Louisiana 66, a sprinkle of trailers, a post office, an elementary school, 3 churches, 2 Baptist, 1 Methodist, a sign that reads, Jesus Christ is Lord of Tunica. Then nothing but trees and descending, as if you were winding through Dante's circles until you hit bottom. The farm, the big house, Alcatraz of the South, Siberia of Dixie, Angola. Those are all names for Angola. The farm, the big house, Alcatraz of the South. So the prison began as a plantation, and it was owned by someone named S.L. James in the 19th century. And he did what was called convict leasing, where he leased prisoners from the state of Louisiana to work on the plantation. It wasn't much different from slavery. In fact, they lived in the old slave quarters. And it wasn't unusual for many of them to die over working there for a season. But the state of Louisiana at that time only had a very small prison, and they leased almost all their prisoners out to work on plantations, to work on building levees on the Mississippi. And then around 1900, the state of Louisiana realized that they could make a profit if they owned this plantation and ran it as a prison. So they bought that same plantation where convicts had been leased for many years, and it became part of Louisiana's state prison system. So this next poem is about that process, about what it means to be a plantation prison. How to make a plantation prison. Buy a plantation, preferably a big one in a remote location. House convicts in the slave quarters. When the quarters collapse, build the convict camp on the same site. Make sure most prisoners are black. Make sure all prisoners know they are expendable. When more than 100 prisoners die in a year, increase arrests. Raise cotton, pick it by hand, or substitute sugar for cotton. Cut that by hand too. Keep profits high by slashing wages to almost nothing, or better yet, eliminate them. Make 12-hour days the norm. Use flogging to combat exhaustion. Spend as little as possible on medical care, nothing on education. Hire prisoners as overseers. Give them guns and no pay. When there's a shooting, don't ask questions. Let's see. Yeah. So there's a photo of picking cotton at Angola in about the time period that that the incident that I'm going to share with you took place. Angola is still run as a farm. There are some other jobs available for prisoners, but everybody who goes to Angola starts in the field as a field worker. And it's a long walk out to the fields because it's such a big place. And they call that walking the long line. And I'll show you a photo of that. Yeah. So that's a more contemporary photo of men walking out to the field, and the guard is on horseback. So here's a poem called Long Line. Ain't got what it takes for the long line today. 4 miles out, 4 miles back, fall in before dawn, back by dinner if you're lucky, after dark if you're not. Scramble for your hoe, dull as the day. If you can't keep up, get whipped. Seasons change, wardens change, the long line stays. Feel the blisters coming on, no socks, no trying on shoes for fit. Slow down, the bat will find you, take you off the field flat. Better to go down swinging that hoe, even if the sun doesn't burn you up. The long line never gets shorter, world without end. Amen. So when I went to Angola, I had already been working on this project for about a year. And the book started right here in Iowa at Anamosa State Penitentiary, where I co-facilitated this book club. And I was a professor at Mount Mercy in Cedar Rapids, and I would take students from my classes. We would read a book in class, and then volunteers from the class would go to prison with me to discuss the book with a selected group of men at Anamosa. And it was a great privilege to be with those men. It was also a real eye-opener for my students, most of whom had never been inside a prison. The stereotypes they had about prisoners quickly fell away, and these men were articulate, funny, congenial, and we had lots of lively discussions about a whole variety of books. So my friend Mary Vermillion and I ran the book club, and it was going so well we decided we wanted to write an article about the book club, that perhaps other colleges might offer something similar. So in writing the article, we read a number of prison memoirs, especially ones where literacy played a key role. Oftentimes, people who are incarcerated, the educational system has failed them. But then in prison, when they have a lot of time on their hands, sometimes they get the education bug. They start reading. And if any of you have read the autobiography of Malcolm X, it was in prison that he really became an educated person. One of the memoirs I read was In the Place of Justice by Wilbert Rideau. And he was in Angola for 40 years. And while he was incarcerated, he became a world-class journalist. They developed an investigative paper that investigated the prison itself under a progressive warden at Angola. So when I was reading this book, he gave a brief history of Angola. And in just 2 sentences, he said, and in 1951, 37 men slit their Achilles tendons as part of a prison protest. And I went, whoa, that you would mutilate yourself because conditions were so terrible. And that just stayed with me. So I started to do some research about that incident, which involved mostly a lot of newspaper reading. It was covered heavily in the press in New Orleans and Baton Rouge, and in a few magazine articles, including one in Life magazine. And I thought, well, maybe I'll write a poem or 2 about this event. But the more I read, the more I became entranced by the complexity of it and the different characters that emerge in thinking about this event. There were the prison administration, the warden, there was the governor that got involved, there were the men themselves, there were the medical people, including a nurse who played a key role, and so these poems, I just kept writing poems. And the title of my book, Remaking Achilles, comes, of course, from the figure of Achilles in the Trojan War. He was a Greek warrior, and his mother had dipped him into the river Styx, holding him by the heel, so that he would become immortal, and his heel was the vulnerable spot. So I thought, oh, boy, that's a great metaphor somehow. I'll see what I can do with that. And conditions at Angola the incident was in 1951, were absolutely horrific. They had been investigated by the Department of Justice several times with a number of recommendations, but nothing really changed. As an earlier poem said, they didn't hire very many guards. They used prisoners as overseers and armed them. So if a prisoner had a grudge against another prisoner, they could pretty much settle that on their own, and no questions would be asked about what happened. There was a lot of to keep working in the fields. They used a bat, they used a strap, they used hose pipes, and it was a very brutal environment. So I started, the more I read about the history of Angola, the more I understood why men might be driven to such an extreme measure to cut their Achilles tendons. And the advantage of doing that would be they wouldn't be able to work in the field. And that's where most of the, a lot of the violence took place. It was kind of out of the eye of things, you know, off in the fields. So here's a poem about the incident itself. Remaking Achilles, the heel slashers. These 31 men had no hope of immortality. After crossing into the underworld of Angola, they sought to live long enough to return to the free world. And so for them, the razor arrow, crippling as it might be, held the hope of mortality, the chance to live before dying. If they couldn't walk, they couldn't work in the fields. And if they couldn't work in the fields, they wouldn't have to confront the convict guards who towered above them on horseback and carried guns. And so they passed the dull blade from man to man in Camp E, the strongest tendon in the body snapping like a window shade. They did not flinch as they hobbled to the hospital in Camp H, dragging their disconnected feet, praying this would be the heel that would save them. This is the hospital in 1951. The first responder was a nurse. Her name was Mary Margaret Dowtry. She was an Irish immigrant. And she was the only medical person on staff full-time for 5,000 prisoners. They would have doctors come in periodically for a few days, but most everything fell to the nurse. And she becomes an important character in the book, not only because she was the first responder, but because later there's an investigation and her testimony was critical in bringing to light some of the abuses at Angola. So here's a poem in the voice of Nurse Dowtry when she first encounters the heel slashers. They shuffled to the hospital in Camp H, one foot dragging behind the other. The warden, the sheriff, the patients, they all turned to me. What was I to do? I had wanted to be a doctor, but that wasn't for women in my day. So I became a nurse. And here they came limping down the hall, a broken line. We couldn't wait the hours it would take to get a doctor here. I had worked in surgery 5 years at Baton Rouge General, so I got out the sutures and stitched those tendons together. Later, talking to the reporters, Dr. Little, who had only worked at Angola a few days, had the nerve to claim, I don't think they have any justification for all this business. I didn't need those boys to tell me why they did it. I had been in every camp in my 7.5 years behind the big gate. I knew what it meant. So one of the things I had fun with in this book was one poem responding to another poem. I don't know if any of you have read Edgar Lee Masters' Spoon River Anthology. It's a series of poems in a cemetery and the dead people speak. But it's a small town, and what one person says later, another person refutes, and you get a kind of back and forth going. So some of the poems in this book are like that, where one poem responds to another. So here's Dr. Little getting his turn to speak his perspective. I was truthful when I told the reporters I had seen no evidence of beatings or brutality. And when the newspaper quoted me as saying, I don't think they have any justification for all this business, I was not part of a cover-up. I had only worked sporadically at Angola, a day here and there for a couple months, and every wound I stitched up came from one inmate stabbing another, so I was told. In the days to come, as I read accounts in the same newspaper where I had denied any mistreatment, I would come to question my own testimony. In these poems, which you can't see, but there are some lines in italics, and those are actual words taken from interviews that took place at the time, mostly through newspapers. And the press played a really important role in bringing the incident to light and then eventually leading to an investigation and some reforms at Angola. For the first 3 weeks, nobody knew what had happened outside the prison. They managed to keep it confined to the prison. But then a prisoner was released who knew about it, and word got out, and then people from the press started to ask questions about what had happened. And papers from New Orleans and from Baton Rouge were particularly significant in bringing attention to this event and eventually exposing some of the terrible conditions at Angola. One of the characters in the book, her name is Maggie Dixon, was the managing editor of the Baton Rouge Morning Advocate. She was one of very few female managing editors at the time, and she had long taken an interest in what happened at Angola, and things would get smuggled onto her desk. Notes would appear about things that had happened at the prison, and then she'd send a reporter out to do more investigative work. So this next poem is the Warden Easterly, and he's responding to this pressure from the press to find out more about what's going on. All this publicity for these heel stringers makes me want to go on a slashing spree. Some prisoners have bragged they can get any official removed they want, but they've got one fellow who's not going to chunk. They're not going to push me around. Camp E, where this all started, is full of degenerates, and they are not going to run this prison. This is a plot to wreck prison discipline and force my removal. The press has no idea what it takes to manage an 18,000-acre farm with this motley workforce. I like to farm, and they don't. But they are not going to sit on their sorry asses and expect the state of Louisiana to feed them. I don't care if they have to crawl to the field. They're going to work, and work hard. So that was the attitude of the warden. And at that time in Louisiana, the warden's job was a kind of plum that was awarded to a friend of the governor. It wasn't someone trained to run a prison necessarily. It was a hand-picked person who would be tough on prisoners. especially sugar cane, which is one of the things they raise there. This is called Lunch with the Warden. E.M. Clinton, reporter from the Times-Picayune. We might have been at a fancy restaurant in Baton Rouge, or guests at a prosperous plantation. The artfully arranged napkins, the salad and dessert forks, the goblets. Lindsay, we've got some censorship going on. The salad and dessert forks, the goblets, our inmate waiters attentive to our every need. Our host, Warden Easterly, eager to talk about this year's cotton crop or his plans for the sugar refinery. We looked out from the veranda at the spring green, lulled by the lushness of the land. After lunch, the warden brought in a tray of weapons, files ground to knives, a toothbrush honed to sharpness, the result of shakedown that morning. Don't be fooled by this idyllic setting. These prisoners are murderers and rapists up to no good. We've got to be vigilant. When we asked about the heel stringers, he waved his hand dismissively. Malingerers just didn't want to work, so they figured a way to get in the hospital and off the duty list. He swiped his mouth with a napkin, as if to say, end of meal, end of story. We pressed for details. When did the heel slashing start? How many? How did the staff respond? What about the allegations of brutality? We wanted a shakedown of the truth. In an office, a string of warden-selected inmates testified how these reports of brutality were exaggerated, publicity seekers. No one had complaints. But stories leaked out from the men we interviewed outside that office. Beatings, forced castor oil, handcuffed to a bedpost overnight standing, the relentless goading to work faster. By the time we insisted on visiting the hospital to talk with the heel stringers themselves, the shakedown of truth had shaken us. We hobbled out of Angola. The warden knew what had happened. He had opened the gates too wide. The next morning, when reporter Ed Stagg from the Item tried to get in, he was told the press was barred, which made us more determined to get in. We had gotten a whiff of Angola, and we weren't stopping. So eventually, there was enough pressure from the press that Governor Earl Long couldn't ignore this situation any longer. And he decided he would call a citizen investigation committee. And he thought by putting a lot of reporters on the committee that he could control the narrative, that he could control who they spoke to and put a certain spin on what had happened. And at first, it seemed to be going in his favor. You know, he selected certain guards that the committee would talk to, and they knew their jobs were on the line, so they towed the line. And prisoners who spoke also knew that if they spoke about some of the truths of Angola, there would be retaliation later. So it wasn't until Nurse Daughtry gave her testimony that things started to break open. And her husband also worked at the prison. He was the manager of the hospital. And they lived at the prison. There was because Angola is so isolated, there was a whole compound where guards and other staff people lived on site. So if she spoke the truth, she was risking her job, her husband's job, their house, their life, the life they had made there. So here's a poem about her decision concerning her testimony to this investigative committee. Nurse Daughtry crosses the Rubicon. When Warden Easterly came to my home, I knew the shit was hitting the fan. Before he could say a word, I told him he didn't have to call me to testify. The committee will want to hear from you. I looked down at my clasped hands. There's nothing wrong here. I looked up, met his glare eye to eye. Name your price, you'll have a job for life. I thought about my husband, the hospital captain. We lived here. This was our life. I told him I'd think it over. When he left, I walked to the hospital and headed for the heel slasher ward. All the injuries I had seen over my 7 years at Angola seemed to rise up from that row of beds. I went to my office and started typing. I didn't stop until morning. So her testimony was key because she could speak over a long period of time, having seen a lot of different injuries that had taken place at Angola. And she wasn't a prisoner. She was a nurse. She was a medical personnel. So her testimony perhaps carried more weight. And the committee started to realize that this was much deeper than the heel slashers themselves. This was a whole system of brutality. Most of the characters in the book are real people. Warden Easterly, Nurse Daughtry, the governor. But I did create a composite character that I call Achilles. And I use him as a kind of representative of, excuse me, of the men at large who slit their Achilles tendons. So he's, this voice is kind of speaking for all the heel slashers. So here's a poem, Achilles responds to Nurse Daughtry's testimony. When we heard about Nurse Daughtry letting it rip to that investigation committee, we did our Hill Street boogie again. If they didn't trust our word, we thought, here's somebody they might believe. We knew she had seen the worst. Men with arms broken by guards, men so weak from days in the dungeon they couldn't walk, men whose backs old Hickory Stick had broken, men with asses torn to pieces from forced sex, men who died from sunstroke, men with heart failure from taking bennies to survive the long line. The day after she gave her testimony, she was gone. We never had the chance to thank her. Over my bed, I taped a picture of a big green hill in Ireland. And every night, I looked at that Irish April and said her name. So the heel slasher incident took place in Camp E. And this is 1951, so the prison is segregated. There are camps spread out around the 18,000 acres. And this one was a white camp, so all of the heel slashers were white. But the investigative committee as they were hearing from Nurse Daughtry, saw that they needed to look more broadly in the prison to see what was going on. So they went to Camp A, which was the African American camp. And it was on Easter that they went there. And they got an earful. And this picture is, the big stick in the middle is what they call Old Hickory. This is now in the Angola Museum. The bat that they used on him. There's a strap, and then these hoses were what they used often to beat men, and especially they had this idea that they wouldn't leave any marks on African Americans because they thought the bruises wouldn't show. So this poem talks about these hoses. And the person whose voice it's in is Hamilton Israel, who was one of the leaders in the African American camp, a prisoner. I don't know exactly what happened. One minute we was eating breakfast, food measly like always, but at least we're not in the field today. Next minute, like a volcano go off. 500 black men throwing bread and spoons and plates. We're used to minding our own business. Complaining will get yourself whipped. None of us Negroes did that heel slashing. But last Wednesday, when that committee come to Camp A, we heard ourselves busting loose. Told about beatings by hosepipe papa, stalks that break your back, Willie and Charles and Henry dropping their pants to show them black grooves. We got called the ringleaders of this so-called riot. We're the ones who spoke up. Told Judge Spade, it's as bad here as it can be or worse. At least 40 men have those hosepipe marks they'll carry to their graves. We all know that rubber hose he uses, thinking it won't leave no signs on black flesh. The warden come busting in, expect us to listen to him. There was no stopping us, you SOB, we yelled at Easterly. Somebody ran in the kitchen and grabbed a meat cleaver, and the warden ran right out with the guards. We know we're going to pay later. The sweat box waiting for us. Easter reversed. But right now, we done astonished ourselves and let the truth explode. So that reference to the sweat box, this is a picture of Camp A. But the reference to the sweat box, there were built into the ground a couple of cells that were just submerged, and so it was total darkness. No windows, no light at all. The walls were painted black, and it was a kind of solitary confinement. And it was also very hot in there. Sometimes men died of sunstroke or heat stroke in these dungeons. And they were in Camp A, the African American camp. So eventually this investigation led to the committee suggested a series of reforms. Nothing much happened as long as Warden Easterly was there. But it became an issue in the governor's race in the next 1952. And so whether or not there would be some reform at Angola. And Earl Long, who was the governor when it happened, lost the election. And his opponent had run partially on saying he would make some reforms at Angola. He appointed a new warden, someone who was a professional in the criminal justice field, and some changes were made. And This photo is the actual destruction of the dungeons. And I have a poem here about that day that the dungeons were destroyed. And it's in the voice of Maggie Dixon, who was that female editor of the paper in Baton Rouge. Dungeons at Angola destroyed by Kennan, that's the new governor, as prisoners watch. That's the headline I wrote, September 24th, 1952, for the Morning Advocate. Over a year had passed since we finished our investigation of the heel stringers. And finally, something was happening. One of our recommendations put into action right there in front of us. The new governor, Robert Kennan, and the new warden, Sam Anderson, drove that bulldozer straight at that hellhole, and in 2 pushes, it was over. It was a staged event. Reporters scribbling, photographers snapping, legislators nodding. But the real event happened behind us. Outside the Camp A dorm, where the prisoners watched, their bodies black against the whitewashed wall. They whooped and hollered as if it were a boxing match. Get him, take him down. As if all those years someone had them by the throat, and now they were back on their feet, swaying and clapping, and no one was going to bury them alive again. So I'm going to close with the final poem in the book. This is the cemetery at Angola. And this is the hearse in which they carry men to the graveyard. It's kind of a ceremonious time. It's pulled by horses, and it's heartbreaking to see the number of white crosses there, those who have died in Angola. And then this final poem is in the voice of that composite character, Achilles. Point Lookout, becoming Achilles. Some inmates want to be buried here. They want that ride up to Lookout in that fancy hearse. Look like a stagecoach pulled by horses. And some make it known they want out, even if it's wrapped in cardboard. Though nowadays, after a body fell right out of a wet box, they got this wood shop turns out a first-class coffin. Me, after my heel got infected, wasn't even allowed into Lookout. No white cross and a picket fence for me. I got shipped to New Orleans in a body bag, smelling like shit, bad as that castor oil day. Those researchers went at me with their razor-sharp knives that I envied. It would have hurt a whole lot less with a blade like that. When they got to my heel, oozing with poison, they named me Achilles. It's the best name I've ever been called. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions about the book, writing the book, whatever? Whatever you would like to hear about. Yes, Dan.
There's so many questions. Did you do any primary research in terms of primary sources? Did you talk to people who had been in the prison or who worked there, or was it mainly newspaper reports and things like that?
You know, everyone involved in this incident was dead. I tried to find, I looked up the names of the heel slashers, and they were all gone. I tried to find, Nurse Daughtry was also dead. So I talked to some people who worked at the prison, but mostly it was newspaper reports. There was Angola has a museum with an archive, just outside the prison. And there's a woman who worked there who's a prison historian. And she was invaluable in leading me to sources and I just scoured the newspapers of that time period. There's not a whole lot that's been written about the incident. It's quite minimal.
I've never heard of it.
Mm-hmm.
So one other question is, did you discover anything about how the prisoners organized themselves to do this? I mean, who?
Mm-hmm.
Because it was what, 30? How many did you say? 37?
Mm-hmm. There were 37, right, right. You
They
know,
must have tried to keep it secret when they were planning it, and did they sort of meet together, or how did they communicate?
well, they were all from the same camp, and they lived in barracks. They did not have individual cells. Even though I showed you a picture of a cell, that's contemporary Angola. So they lived like sometimes as many as 300 men in one building, more like an army barracks kind of thing. So they were
Talking among themselves.
They were talking among themselves, right. And, in terms of getting the razor blade, I think, from what I read, getting contraband in Angola was pretty easy. And it actually turned out, I did read, I read a couple of interviews with one of the heel slashers. He was like the last living person, he's dead now, but he had been interviewed a couple of times. And his name was Wallace McDonald, and he had tried to escape from Angola. And because he had tried to escape, he was a target for more abuse. So he had a kind of, and there were 6 men who tried to escape together, and all 6 of them were part of the heel slashers. So they were getting even worse treatment than usual, which was pretty bad. So they were the ringleaders, and then it just spread, is my understanding. So it almost, in some ways, it was a protest, but they were really trying to save their lives. These 6 men thought that they would be killed in the fields as punishment for trying to escape. And then it spread to the other men and became a broader symbol of the conditions in Angola at the time. Yeah. And they actually, they each did 1 foot. Now I can't remember if I said it was their left or their right, but anyway, they all did the same foot. And then when it started to heal, they did the other one. Because the investigation really hadn't happened yet. And they were going to be sent back to the fields. So they were desperate.
Was that also a coordinated action?
Yes, the second one, yeah. And it was the same man.
Yeah.
So they were in the hospital.
Right.
So they were together on that ward when they decided they were going to do the second one.
So the primary purpose was to avoid going to the fields where they felt they would probably die.
Where they felt they were in danger.
But did they make any kind of a public statement? It was a protest in a way, but they assumed that someone would find out about it and then come investigate?
Right. They didn't make any manifesto or, these are the things we want addressed.
Right.
No, they didn't do that.
Yeah.
So it was really, they were hoping that somehow this event would be startling enough that it would draw attention to people wanting to know why did they do this. We want to know what's going on that would drive people to do this.
I wonder if the stories of this have been passed down to the generations, the children, the grandchildren, and the great-grandchildren.
That would be fascinating to try to find out. Of course, many of the men were, if not lifers, close to life, being in life imprisonment. And so, in terms of contact with families,
Right.
I'm guessing for many of them had been broken.
I was looking at this Hearst, contrasting it with the treatment that they were given.
Yeah.
Alive, it's just an unbridgeable difference.
Right. We'll give you a fancy burial, but your life here is a horror.
Apparently, all those sutures worked. It's really not an easy thing to do. Tie it to an Achilles tendon
Right.
effectively so it healed.
The interviews I read with Wallace McDonald, the survivor, he was the last standing man. He always walked with a limp, so it wasn't seamless.
Did he do the second heel also?
He did.
Oh, okay.
And thinking about sort of the larger picture of what happened there, there were a number of reforms put in place with the new governor, the new warden. But in reading Wilbert Radau's memoir of Angola, which covered a 40-year period, there's reform and then things fall back. And then there's reform and things fall back. So in the 70s, there was another period of kind of just terrible conditions at Angola. It didn't stick. So much depends on the warden. And Louisiana at the time also had, this is 1951, they had the mentality of, we shouldn't spend any money on the prison. The farm should pay. They had a cannery there. They sold on the open market canned goods. The prison should pay for itself. So there was very little funds put into any kind of health care, nothing in the way of education at that time, etc. Andy?
How would you characterize conditions there today?
Well, I can't, I was an outsider on a visit, so they present you with their good face. But I think it's definitely, you don't have the beatings in the fields. It's still, I think, a very difficult place to be, as most prisons are. Burl Kane was the warden there he was the warden when I went to visit. He's no longer the warden. And he was an extroverted Christian. I mean, he made no bones that he was going to try to bring Christian principles into the prison. And he had more, they had family days, or kind of a carnival almost, where the kids of prisoners would come in. One thing Angola is known for is its rodeo, which, has a lot of complicated issues with it, because men putting themselves at risk for a show, but many of the prisoners loved it, learning to ride rodeo. I think it's, some of the literature I read was that Angola has become, they're doing a lot of work on sort of best practices about recidivism. They have groups of insiders who they try to maintain some ties with people recently released to maintain friendships, and then the people on the outside then start mentoring those who are getting ready to be released. And supposedly they've had some success with their model to prevent recidivism. So, you know, it's hard to know exactly. But it's definitely, I think, better than it was, for sure.
Is there still private contracting for the prison labor? Are companies hiring to have work done by the prisons?
Yes,
Prisoners?
yes.
And any idea, is this still agriculture or is it now
It's-
producing goods?
It's diversified. They no longer, they supply produce for all the prison system in Louisiana, but they're not on the open market. There were some complaints that they were underselling other farms. So they don't have their own cannery. They just provide produce for the prison system. And they have like an automotive shop. They repair bicycles for a program that gives away bicycles to kids in need. So there are a number of different industries now. But everybody who first comes to Angola works in the field. You have to kind of, that's like your starting job. So agriculture is still very much a part of this prison. A similar prison in Alabama, Parchman Farm, is also really well known as a kind of plantation prison.
Did you share your hopes with the prisoners at Anamosa or your experiences?
Unfortunately, COVID hit, and we haven't been allowed back into the prison since the book came out. But I did give a Zoom reading, and the men in the book club, it was kind of a miracle because at that moment, it was hard to get anything to happen in the prison outside of just maintaining itself. But they got the Zoom meeting set up, and the men participated in the online reading.
How did they respond?
They were really happy to be there, and the book is dedicated to them.
Oh, wonderful.
And they've also each received a copy of it. So they were really happy to be together as the book club again. Because it was COVID, it had been at least a year since we had been seeing them. So it was such a joy just to be, even on Zoom, to see their faces.
I would think the prison authorities would be a little nervous about prisoners reading about this kind of collective action.
Yes. I think if I hadn't been the one who written the book, they probably would not have been allowed to have it. But because the prison knew me, I think they let it go. But yes, you're right.
Well, and they probably assumed that their abuses were not nearly anything that would cause someone to slash their Achilles.
You know, yeah.
Must be amazing to consider, for you to consider what you just said, that had it not been you who wrote this book, had it not been
what were some of the books the men wanted to do in the near future. And one of them was An American Marriage by T.R.E. Jones, which is about an African-American couple, and the man is in prison, and it's about what that does to their relationship. And I thought, would they really want to read something that close to home? But they were just like, yes, we want to read that. You know, to see your own, the facets of your own experience perhaps reflected in a literary work. Yeah. Mhm.
What was particularly difficult for you in the process of writing this book?
I think I don't like to think that we as humans are capable of so much cruelty to others. It pushes against my desire to see people as good. And when you read about so much brutality, it pushed against my worldview. And that's uncomfortable. I don't like to think that people would be that cruel. Yeah. And of course, I mean, this happens in Iowa too. We have such a disproportionate number of people of color in prison in Iowa compared to our population. But in the South, especially, you know, after the Civil War, prisons were a way to re-enslave people. If you've read The New Jim Crow, you know, people were picked up for vagrancy and all kinds of, you know, harmless things. I mean, people not breaking the law and put into chain gangs, and the disproportionate number of people of color in prison all over the U.S. That's another thing that's hard. I did think it was interesting, a couple of people who read the manuscript as I was getting ready to send it out, they read the whole book, and it wasn't until they read the Easter Uprising poem comes fairly late in the book. And they just assumed that the prisoners were African American who had slit their Achilles tendons. And they were just kind of surprised, oh, they're white. Yeah. There's also, and I didn't go into this in the reading, but Warden Easterly used the word degenerates when he talked about camping, and he's using that word as a code word for homosexuality. And it was true, there was a lot of sexual slavery at Angola, all different kinds of relationships between prisoners. But if you were homosexual and in prison, and people knew that, your life was hell. So the actual character of Achilles in here, I didn't read this particular poem, but I made him a gay man. And he got targeted, and there's a reference to the Castor Oil Day. And I read this, again, I made up this character, but the things that happened to him, I took from incidents that I had read about, that prisoners given castor oil and then chained to a post so that they were shitting all day long. what's hopeful is the courage and the tenacity of the press and those who worked to get the story out. And Maggie Dixon, she was a lifelong advocate for prisoners. She would get these stories left on her typewriter and send a reporter in to investigate incidents that happened at Angola. And she was a much beloved person at Angola among the men. Yeah. And we all know we've got a lot of work to do with prison reform here and around the world, but there's much to be done. And I was reading recently, can't remember, there's a court case recently about prison labor. And, again, rethinking what are prisoner rights. It says in the Constitution that you can't be forced to work, I can't remember the exact wording, but except if you're a criminal. Right. And there are some states that have changed that in their state constitution. That you can't be forced to work or just because you're a criminal. That is charged with being a criminal. Well, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
I hope you took something from the presentation and
So you brought your books with you?
I did. If anybody, I have Remaking Achilles, which is $10, and then I also have a couple copies of my previous book, Rising to the Brim, which is a much gentler book.
Very nice book.
Is it also about prisons?
No, it's about my things that have happened to me,
Oh.
and it's more personal poetry. And then I also brought my first book, 50 Poems, which are 50 poems written in my 50s, largely about a move and a transition. So, if you would like one,